Welcome to Crossroads. The World Health Organization, the WHO, they have now officially passed this controversial pandemic accord. It is now in place globally, except here in the United States. Now, this international agreement, it is legally binding. They say it's, again, voluntary, but if you're part of it, it's legally binding. And the whole thing started back in 2021 during the response to COVID-19. What this agreement does, at least on the surface, right, it creates a new program for global sharing of pathogen data and samples on anything that could allegedly spark a pandemic. It also makes it so that any pharmaceutical manufacturers that are part of this whole system, 20% of their products have to be given for so-called equitable distribution. What does that mean? Well, it means that we're going to be effectively bankrolling the developing world, 20% additional cost probably for everybody else. This also creates a much broader system, by the way, overall of countries, part of the agreement to also have surveillance and stuff in place for potential outbreaks, how to detect it, how to respond to it. And that means, of course, all those broader systems of What does that mean? It means that the entire medical industry is no longer necessarily private, per se. All findings, research, all these things need to be transferred. They do say some of that is voluntary, but we'll see how that goes. Now, Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, declared that the pandemic accord is now official. And he wrote on X that it's official. The pandemic accord is officially adopted by the World Health Assembly. My warmest congratulations to WHO member states for their commitment to keep their people and the world safer. What a moment in global health history together. Now, as we know, the United States, at least currently, is not part of the World Health Organization. Donald Trump withdrew us from the organization back in January. You might remember he did the same thing during his first term in office at the very end when the whole pandemic was hitting, pulled us out. Joe Biden brought us back into the WHO. Trump pulled us out yet again. We will see how permanent it is, but there's some moves to make it permanent we'll discuss in a bit. But much of the world right now, they are part of this. This pandemic accord applies to most countries in the world except the United States. Now, RFK Jr. gave more context as to why the United States withdrew from the World Health Organization and the U.S. position on the pandemic treaty. This was during an address to the World Health Assembly earlier this week. Watch.
The WHO has become mired in bureaucratic bloat, entrenched paradigms, conflicts of interest, and international power politics. While the United States has provided the lion's share of the organization's funding historically, other countries, such as China, have exerted undue influence over its operations in ways that serve their own interests and not particularly the interests of the global public. Global cooperation on health is still critically important to President Trump and myself, but it isn't working very well under the WHO, as the failures of the COVID era demonstrate. The WHO has not even come to terms with its failures during COVID, let alone made significant reforms. Instead, it has doubled down with the pandemic agreement, which will lock in all of the dysfunctions of the WHO pandemic response. Well, we're not going to participate in that. We need to reboot the whole system, as we are doing in the United States. Here in the United States.
Now, this raises some important points. Among the broader concerns of the pandemic accord is that it undermines some elements of national sovereignty, right? The power of an individual state, they have now given some of those powers to a globalist organization. Now, you could say, again, it's voluntary. They're part of the World Health Organization. They did this willingly. It gives a lot more power to this global government institution. Again, countries have effectively surrendered some of their own sovereignty to this. And in the past, the WHO has been unable to demonstrate its independence from the Chinese Communist Party, raising concerns that as countries have surrendered some of their own sovereignty to the WHO, The WHO has in turn surrendered its sovereignty to the Chinese Communist Party. Remember when Trump pulled the United States out of it? That was the big issue. They did big research, they did studies, they asked questions to him. There was an entire investigative process, and they determined the World Health Organization could not demonstrate that it was independent from the CCP, meaning the CCP puppeteers it. And that also raises concerns over how the CCP may be able to use this to basically control the health policies of the entire world in its favor, to an extent. Now, RFK Jr. also pointed out some of the undue influence the CCP has over the world, over this WHO. This was in his World Health Assembly address. Watch this.
China have exerted undue influence over its operations in ways that serve their own interests and not particularly the interests of the global public. This all became obvious during the COVID pandemic when the WHO, under pressure from China, suppressed reports at critical junctures of human-to-human transmission.
And on that point, after the U.S. withdrew, the World Health Organization was facing an existential crisis. In fact, even recently, they were saying that they may not be able to make it with their current financing. Even right now, that's still kind of the case. That mainly happened because a huge chunk of its funding used to come from the United States. As we find out we're paying for just about everything on the face of the planet, the World Health Organization was also being bankrolled by American taxpayers. But what happened? Well, the Chinese Communist Party, as many people were concerned would happen, that was one of the arguments for not pulling out, the CCP swooped in and bailed out the WHO to an extent, not fully. The CCP is donating about $100 million a year to the WHO for the next 5 years. And there are concerns, as we've seen in allegations in the past, that this money could have strings attached. The CCP is not doing this for no reason. They're not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. This could result in the CCP gaining even more influence over the global institution, which now has some degree of global control over health policies. And these concerns are also being raised right here in the United States. In fact, Representative Tom Tiffany, he noted this as well. He said there needs to be a stronger policy in place to ensure that the United States is never again brought back into the WHO. And he's calling for Congress to pass legislation to make sure that Trump's withdrawal stays there, that it's permanent. Here's what he wrote on X. He said President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the WHO, and Congress must codify this decision ASAP. We should never spend another day or dime in this corrupt China-first organization. Now, will that happen? We shall see. It is likely that a lot of members of Congress would vote on that. The issue of the WHO tends to be kind of partisan, mainly because Trump pulled us out of it. So we shall see.